Electra did not notice the change all at once. It crept into her life the way humidity settles into a room, slowly, invisibly, until breathing itself feels altered. At first, it was nothing she could name without sounding paranoid even to herself. Will still came home, still spoke to her with the same gentle cadence, still reached for her hand in moments that should have felt grounding. Yet something in the rhythm of their shared days had shifted, as if an unseen metronome had been recalibrated. Conversations ended a beat too early. Silences lingered a beat too long. And within those spaces, something else seemed to be growing. Dylan arrived into their orbit without drama, without the kind of disruptive force that usually announces danger. That, perhaps, was the first warning Electra ignored. Dylan did not intrude, she integrated. She listened more than she spoke, observed more than she revealed. Her presence felt useful, almost necessary, slipping into Will's life with a seamlessness that made it difficult to question. There was no flirtation that could be pointed to, no overt intimacy that could be challenged. Instead, there was alignment. Dylan laughed at the right moments. She remembered details Will himself often forgot. She offered solutions before problems were fully articulated. Watching them together felt less like witnessing attraction, and more like observing a system quietly reconfiguring itself. What unsettled Electra most was not jealousy in its familiar form. There was no spike of fear that Will might be physically unfaithful, no sudden urge to search for messages, or interrogate glances. What she felt instead was displacement. It was as if the architecture of Will's emotional life was being subtly redesigned, with Dylan positioned at its center. The dependency forming between them did not announce itself through passion, but through efficiency. Dylan became the one Will consulted first, the one whose opinion seemed to settle his indecision. Electra noticed how often he deferred now, how relief crossed his face when Dylan spoke, as though she had articulated something he had been carrying without knowing how to name. Electra began to replay moments in her mind, searching for the exact point where she had been moved from center to periphery. She remembered the way Will once relied on her instinctively, how their lives had been built on an unspoken understanding that they faced the world together. Now, that understanding felt diluted, stretched thin by a third presence that did not compete, but replace. Dylan did not challenge Electra's position, she made it irrelevant. And that realization brought with it a colder fear than jealousy ever could. As days passed, Electra became acutely aware of patterns. Will's stories began to change, not in content, but in framing. Experiences he once shared with Electra were now narrated through Dylan's perspective, her interpretations layered over his memories. The effect was disorienting, as if Electra were watching her own history being edited in real time. She found herself questioning whether she was overreacting, whether the discomfort she felt was merely insecurity dressed up as intuition. Yet the unease persisted, growing sharper each time she noticed how naturally Dylan anticipated Will's needs. What Electra could not articulate to anyone else, she admitted only in private moments of brutal honesty, it felt orchestrated. Not in the dramatic sense of a villain plotting seduction, but in the methodical way systems are designed. Dylan did not pull Will away, she created conditions in which Will drifted. She did not isolate Electra directly, she rendered her unnecessary. That distinction mattered, because it made resistance feel unreasonable. How do you confront someone for being competent, attentive, indispensable? The thought that began as a flicker soon hardened into suspicion. Dylan's emotional proximity to Will felt too precise, too calibrated. Electra began to scrutinize the details she had previously dismissed as quirks. The way Dylan avoided discussing her past, the inconsistencies in her timeline, the way her expressions sometimes lagged a fraction of a second behind the conversation, as if she were translating rather than reacting. These were not flaws, they were seams. And once Elektra noticed them, she could not stop looking. The name Luna surfaced in her mind without invitation. It arrived as a memory rather than a theory, carrying with it the weight of unfinished business and unresolved dread. Elektra had buried that chapter carefully, convinced that its danger had passed. Yet the resemblance, once seen, refused to be unseen. Not physical resemblance alone, faces can be altered, features reshaped, but behavioral echoes. The same strategic gentleness. The same ability to mirror rather than reveal. The same unsettling talent for becoming whatever the moment required. Elektra's fear shifted then, transforming from displacement into alarm. If Dylan was not merely a new presence, but a constructed one, then the changes in Will's life were not accidental. They were purposeful. The dependence forming between them began to look less like coincidence and more like design. Elektra considered the possibility that Dylan's growing emotional connection to Will was not an emergent feeling, but an engineered outcome. That possibility reframed everything. The altered rhythms, the subtle exclusions, the quiet recentering of Will's world around someone else, it all began to align into a pattern that felt too deliberate to ignore. Will, oblivious or unwilling to see, moved through these changes with a calm that unsettled Elektra further. He spoke of Dylan with appreciation rather than affection, describing her as someone who understood him, who made things simpler. Those words stung more than any confession of desire could have. Simplicity, Elektra knew, was seductive. It promised relief from complexity, from the emotional labor of mutuality. If Dylan offered Will a version of himself that felt easier to inhabit, then Elektra's presence, rooted in shared history, in depth and contradiction, might begin to feel burdensome by comparison. Elektra's internal conflict deepened. She questioned her own motives, wondering whether her suspicions were driven by fear of loss rather than genuine concern. Yet each attempt to dismiss her intuition only sharpened it. She began to see how Dylan positioned herself not as a rival, but as infrastructure, embedding herself into Will's routines until her absence would feel disruptive. It was a strategy Elektra recognized too late, one that did not announce intention, but ensured outcome. The idea that Dylan might be Luna resurfaced with increasing clarity. Elektra revisited old memories, reconstructing timelines, examining what had been left unresolved. Luna had always been adept at reinvention, at shedding identities like skins. Surgery, in that context, was not an obstacle but an extension. If Luna had returned under a new name, a new face, then the goal would not be revenge in any obvious sense. It would be reclamation. Control. The slow, methodical reassertion of influence over a life she believed should never have slipped beyond her grasp. Elektra found herself trapped between urgency and caution. Accusing Dylan without proof would only accelerate her own marginalization, casting her as unstable, jealous, threatened by an imagined rival. Yet doing nothing felt like complicity in her own erasure. The tension between those impulses consumed her, manifesting as sleepless nights and fragmented thoughts. She watched Will more closely now, not to catch him in wrongdoing, but to understand how deeply the shift had taken root. What she saw frightened her, not betrayal, but adaptation. Will was changing, subtly, steadily, adjusting to a new emotional gravity. The most painful realization came when Elektra acknowledged that whatever Dylan's true identity, her impact was real. Even if she was wrong about Luna, even if Dylan was exactly who she claimed to be, the outcome was the same. Will's life was being restructured in a way that excluded Elektra, and that restructuring thrived on invisibility. It did not need to destroy Elektra outright, it only needed to make her irrelevant. Elektra began to understand that the true threat was not romantic displacement, but narrative control. Dylan shaped the story Will told himself about his needs, his stress, his sense of being understood. In that story, Electra existed, but as background rather than anchor. That shift, once complete, would be irreversible. The thought chilled her. She realized that waiting for proof might mean waiting too long. As the week unfolded, the tension reached a quiet crescendo. Electra stood at the edge of a truth that could upend everything. Either she was witnessing the most sophisticated emotional manipulation she had ever encountered, or she was confronting the slow decay of a relationship she had believed unshakable. In both scenarios, the cost of inaction was the same. The difference lay in what she was willing to risk to stop it. Electra did not yet know how she would act, only that she could no longer pretend nothing was wrong. The rhythms of her life had changed for a reason, and whether that reason wore the face of Dylan, or the ghost of Luna, it was moving with intention. What frightened her most was not the possibility that Will might choose someone else, but that the choice might be made without him ever realizing he had been guided toward it. In that realization, Electra found a grim clarity. This was not a battle for affection, but for agency. And whatever came next would demand more than suspicion. It would demand confrontation, exposure, and the courage to name what others preferred to overlook. Because if Dylan was not Dylan, then the plan was already in motion. And if she was, then the plan was even more dangerous, for it meant that the erosion of Electra's place in Will's life was not malicious, only efficient. Thomas did not announce his withdrawal in a way that invited negotiation. There was no argument to soften, no ultimatum to resist, no visible fracture that could be hurriedly repaired. His decision arrived quietly, carried on the language of restraint and fatigue, framed as a need rather than a rejection. He spoke of space as if it were a practical requirement, something measurable and temporary, a matter of balance rather than rupture. Yet beneath that calm articulation lay a deeper truth he could not fully name. He was retreating not to recover strength, but to preserve coherence. The world around him had grown too loud, too crowded with interpretations of who he was supposed to be, what he was supposed to want, and how he was supposed to atone. Stepping back felt less like abandonment and more like survival. For Thomas, distance had always been a double-edged act. In the past, retreat had often been interpreted as avoidance, proof of instability, or unwillingness to confront consequences. This time, he framed it differently, even to himself. He believed that stepping away could interrupt a familiar cycle, that by removing himself from the center of emotional turbulence, he might finally escape its gravitational pull. He did not see his withdrawal as surrender, but as an attempt to regain authorship over his own narrative. What he underestimated was how quickly a vacuum invites occupation, how silence creates an opportunity for others to speak on your behalf. The absence Thomas left behind was not dramatic enough to alarm anyone immediately. Life adjusted, routines shifted, conversations continued without his input. Yet that very ordinariness made the space dangerous. When someone as emotionally central as Thomas steps back, the structure does not collapse, it reorganizes. Into that reorganization stepped someone who understood timing better than intent, someone who recognized that moments of uncertainty are more persuasive than moments of crisis. This person did not rush in with accusations or demands. Instead, they introduced a story, subtle, plausible, and tailored precisely to the anxieties already present. The story took many forms, depending on who heard it. To some, it was framed as concern, a quiet suggestion that Thomas's withdrawal signaled unresolved issues, that his need for space might conceal a deeper instability. To others, it was cast as coincidence, a seemingly innocent alignment of events that placed Thomas at the center of a misunderstanding not of his making. There were conversations that overlapped just enough to blur intention, agreements that appeared informal, but carried the weight of expectation, and encounters described afterward with a specificity that felt rehearsed. None of it was overtly malicious. That was its strength. Each fragment of the story was reasonable on its own. Together, they formed a narrative that did not accuse Thomas outright, but positioned him as the most likely explanation for a growing sense of unease. What made this manipulation particularly effective was its reliance on Thomas's absence. Without his presence to contextualize events, the story gained autonomy. People filled the silence with inference, interpreting restraint as secrecy, distance as indifference, self-preservation as guilt. The person who seeded the narrative understood this psychology intimately. They did not need to fabricate Thomas's flaws. They only needed to remind others of the versions of him they already remembered. History, selectively recalled, did the rest. Thomas, meanwhile, experienced his withdrawal as both relief and disorientation. The quiet he sought arrived, but it was not the restorative silence he had imagined. Instead, it felt hollow, stripped of grounding reference points. He sensed shifts he could not see, changes occurring beyond the perimeter he had drawn. Messages arrived less frequently, then with altered tone. When he did encounter others, he felt a subtle recalibration in their responses, an edge of hesitation where familiarity once lived. No one confronted him directly. That, too, was part of the design. Confrontation invites clarity. Ambiguity invites doubt. As the weeks unfolded, the story began to solidify into consequence. A relationship strained under the weight of assumptions Thomas did not know existed. A professional opportunity hesitated, stalled by concerns that were never explicitly stated. Even moments meant to be neutral carried an undercurrent of judgment, as if Thomas's withdrawal had transformed him into a variable to be managed rather than a person to be understood. He found himself questioning the wisdom of his retreat, wondering whether space had ever truly been his to claim. The internal conflict this produced was profound. Thomas had stepped back to escape the distortion of his identity, only to discover that absence magnified distortion rather than diminished it. He wrestled with the temptation to reinsert himself forcefully, to confront the narrative head-on and reclaim control. Yet doing so risked validating the very suspicions he wished to dispel. Returning too abruptly would appear defensive. Remaining distant would allow the story to calcify. The dilemma trapped him in a posture of reactive restraint, where every option seemed to carry the same cost. The person who exploited the vacuum understood this tension and leveraged it with precision. They positioned themselves as a stabilizing presence, someone who could manage the fallout of Thomas's absence. In doing so, they gained credibility, presenting themselves as a reliable interpreter of events. Their version of the story became the default not because it was aggressive, but because it was available. They did not claim Thomas was at fault. They simply suggested that his withdrawal created complications that others now had to resolve. Responsibility shifted quietly, invisibly, until Thomas found himself implicated without accusation. What made the situation particularly cruel was its plausibility. There were no obvious villains, no dramatic betrayals that could be easily named. Everything unfolded within the realm of reasonable misunderstanding. That ambiguity eroded Thomas's confidence in his own perceptions. He began to question whether he had miscalculated, whether his need for space had been selfish rather than necessary. The self-doubt that followed was more damaging than any external judgment. It weakened his resolve, making him hesitant to challenge the narrative taking shape around him. As the story evolved, it reached a critical point, a manufactured incident that crystallized all the preceding assumptions. It was framed as coincidence, an unfortunate overlap of circumstances that placed Thomas at the center of a rupture he had not actively caused. Yet the conditions that made this rupture possible had been carefully arranged. A meeting scheduled without his knowledge, an agreement implied, but never confirmed, a moment recounted with selective emphasis. When the fallout came, it felt inevitable, as though the situation had been moving toward this conclusion all along. The aftermath was swift. Relationships fractured under the strain of misinterpreted intent. Thomas's name became shorthand for complication, for unresolved tension others were tired of navigating. He was not condemned outright, he was quietly sidelined, treated as someone whose presence required caution. The irony was devastating. In seeking time alone to prevent further harm, he had become the symbolic source of a new breakdown. Thomas's response to this realization marked a turning point. He could no longer afford the luxury of silence. Withdrawal, he understood now, is not neutral. It creates space not only for reflection, but for projection. By stepping back without defining the terms of his absence, he had allowed others to define it for him. The question was no longer whether he should return, but how. Reentry would require more than explanation. It would require confronting the structures that had benefited from his absence. The emotional toll of this confrontation was immense. Thomas grappled with anger, not only at the person who had exploited the vacuum, but at himself for underestimating the consequences of retreat. He recognized patterns repeating, not because he was incapable of change, but because others found those patterns convenient. The narrative built around him did not reflect who he was becoming, but who he had once been. Breaking free of it would demand a level of vulnerability he was not sure he could sustain. Yet within that vulnerability lay the possibility of transformation. Thomas began to see that reclaiming his story did not mean denying his past or disproving every accusation. It meant asserting his present with clarity and intention. He could name the manipulation without dramatizing it, expose the coincidences without sounding defensive, and articulate his need for space without apologizing for it. Doing so would not undo the damage already done, but it could prevent further erosion. The confrontation, when it came, was quieter than anyone expected. There were no explosive revelations, no public unmaskings. Instead, Thomas spoke with deliberate precision, dismantling the narrative piece by piece. He acknowledged his withdrawal, explained its purpose, and named the ways in which it had been misinterpreted. He did not accuse, he contextualized. That approach unsettled those who had benefited from ambiguity. Without drama to distract, the manipulation became visible in its subtlety. The resolution, if it could be called that, was incomplete. Some relationships could not be restored to their previous state. Trust, once compromised, does not reassemble easily. Yet the story surrounding Thomas shifted. He was no longer the silent center of speculation, but an active participant in defining his role. The person who had exploited the vacuum found their influence diminished, their narrative power weakened by exposure. What Thomas learned through this ordeal was both sobering and clarifying. Withdrawal is not inherently wrong, but it is never consequence-free. In systems built on perception, absence is interpreted before it is understood. Taking space requires boundaries that are not only internal, but communicated, lest silence become a canvas for others' designs. Thomas emerged from the experience changed, not hardened, but sharpened, aware now of how easily intention can be overwritten when left undefended. The breakdown he became the center of was not the one he feared, but it revealed something essential about the world he inhabited. Space, he realized, is political. It is claimed, filled, and weaponized. To step away is to invite interpretation. To return is to confront what has been built in your absence. And sometimes, the most dangerous thing is not staying too close, but leaving without telling your story first.